We're going to follow up the process of photosynthesis with that of cellular respiration, or simply cell respiration. It's important to note that these two are tied together. There is no point in having one without having the other. If you follow along here, you can see the progression of energy. All energy that sustains life starts off with the sun. The sun, of course, hits the plant. It goes through the process of photosynthesis, which you just finished learning about, and produces that all-important sugar molecule, which is simply a different form of energy. Back here, energy was in the form of light, and now energy is in the form of a chemical. This chemical can be stored for long-term usage. But the usage only comes about if you can take that chemical energy of sugar and convert it through the process of cell respiration into the actual usable chemical that living things require to sustain their own lives. And that is what's called ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. That's the energy that all living things are going to use as their source of energy. It's important to note here also that photosynthesis is not simply what takes place in plants and cell respiration in animals. Plants do both of these things. It's not as if the plant went through photosynthesis so that it could produce sugar for us. The plant goes through photosynthesis, produces sugar, and then it also goes through cell respiration to convert that sugar to ATP for its own source of energy. We just happen to come into the middle of this whole continuation. We eat the plant and therefore consume its sugar because we only have the ability to go through cell respiration as a consumer to then produce ATP for our own lives. Speaking of ATP, we look at a cycle of ATP here, and this is the molecule itself, and you can see adenosine triphosphate has, of course, based on the name, 3 phosphate molecules. And when we need energy, what we do is to basically chemically rip off the third of those 3 phosphates, which is what you're seeing here, and the energy that is in that chemical bond right there, that little black line, is really important because that's the energy that sustains us. But of course, once we have ripped off that third of the 3 phosphates, ATP isn't ATP any longer, it's ADP, adenosine diphosphate. So cell respiration, which is our topic here, is really about taking these ADP molecules, adding energy and that third phosphate back on so that you constantly have a stock supply of ATP. So this whole left half of this cycle is really representative of cell respiration. There are multiple steps to this process, multiple chemical reactions that must take place, and the first of those stages is called glycolysis. Glycolysis is an anaerobic step, a step or a chemical reaction that means that it requires no oxygen presence necessary for this chemical reaction to take place. And it is taking place within the cytosol of all of our cells. We start off, as you would expect, with sugar. The end product of photosynthesis is now the beginning of cell respiration. In order to get this glycolysis reaction started, some chemical reactions require the input of energy. It's called activation energy. And you can see 2 ATP molecules are actually being used up. In other words, even though this whole process of cell respiration is all about the production of ATP, the making of more ATP, it actually costs some ATP in order to get the process started. So it's going to cost you 2 ATP molecules, but the benefit is you'll make more. The reaction that occurs in glycolysis is that sugar molecule is basically chopped in half into 2 3-carbon molecules. And in doing so, there's enough energy given off to make 4 molecules of ATP. So it costs you 2, but you made 4, so you made out in the end. What you also produce is another high energy chemical called NADH, and yet another high energy chemical, which are those 2 3-carbon molecules, called pyruvate. So again, like I said with photosynthesis, I care that you know what goes in and what comes out. What goes into glycolysis would be sugar and ATP, and what comes out is more ATP, pyruvate, and NADH. Both of these are chemical energy, but they're chemical energy that is not what we want. We want ATP. The remainder of cell respiration is going to take place specifically within the mitochondria of our cells. And the rest of it is going to be referenced as aerobic cell respiration because it does require the presence of oxygen. In other words, this is why we breathe. We take in oxygen so that we can go through the aerobic portion of cell respiration. Now it looks like there's a lot going on here, and there is. You see the backdrop here is that mitochondria, so there is separate sets of chemical reactions that are taking place here. First of all, we've got the pyruvate that was the product of glycolysis, and it's going to enter the mitochondria, and it's going to go through a cyclical set of chemical reactions called the Krebs cycle, and you're going to have three products. So again, what goes in? What goes in is the pyruvate. What comes out would be ATP, and specifically 2 molecules of it, which is great because, again, that's what we're after. What also comes out would be a waste product that you're familiar with, carbon dioxide. This is why carbon dioxide builds up in our bodies, and it has to diffuse into our bloodstream and get back to our lungs where we can exhale it. And of course, gas exchange takes place, and we take in oxygen at the same time. The third product of the Krebs cycle is another high-energy molecule called FADH2. So pyruvate in, ATP, carbon dioxide, and FADH2 out. That leads us to our third and final portion of cell respiration, which is called electron transport. It's going to take in everything that's left. So the FADH2 from the Krebs cycle and the NADH that was way back from glycolysis, along with the oxygen that we breathe in, is all going to go through the electron transport portion of things. And ultimately what gets made in the whole process would be water, and most importantly, 32 molecules of ATP. That's the big payoff at the end. We gained 2 molecules of ATP from glycolysis. We gained 2 molecules of ATP through the Krebs cycle, but we're going to gain 32 molecules through the electron transport portion of things. Now, with all of that detail in mind, we do have a second system for making some energy. We've already referenced the idea of glycolysis, and that then, in the presence of oxygen, we go through aerobic cell respiration. That's everything we just described. But what happens when we are lacking oxygen? What happens when, for instance, during exercise, we are churning through all the oxygen that we can possibly take in, and we can't take it in any faster? We still might need some energy. And so we have a backup system. We can continue to go through glycolysis because that's an anaerobic step of cell respiration. But without oxygen present, we can also go through something called fermentation. And specifically, the type of fermentation that we go through is something called lactic acid fermentation. Here, initially, in that process, you can see what you already have seen, glycolysis. There's the ATP, and there's the NADH, and there's the pyruvate that were made as a result of that chemical reaction. But instead of the pyruvate going through the mitochondria and going through the Krebs cycle and electron transport, it can't do that because you are not delivering enough oxygen to your cells during very demanding times. As I said, like very intense exercise. And so basically what happens is that the pyruvate gets converted into a product called lactic acid, and it's going to sit in your cells until it can be removed. But in essence, it allows your cells to go back through glycolysis a second time, which supplies you with a little bit of ATP. Now, it's not much. It's not much at all, but it can sustain you for brief periods of time until more oxygen gets delivered, and then you'll immediately revert back to going through aerobic cell respiration, of course, until you use up all that oxygen, and then you'll kick back into this process again. There is one other version of this that is an anaerobic process called alcoholic fermentation. This is not something that we do, but other living things do. And this, of course, is how we mass produce alcohol as well. It's the same basic process. Here's glycolysis again. There's the pyruvate. But some organisms, instead of taking the pyruvate and converting them into lactic acid, instead convert them into alcohol and carbon dioxide. And again, it allows those organisms to go back through glycolysis again, making small quantities of ATP. The example you're probably most familiar with here would be yeast. Yeast are living things. And when we, for instance, make some kind of alcohol, we put those yeast in with, let's say, grapes if we're going to make wine. Grapes, of course, have sugar. And so there's the food source for those yeast. And we seal them off, deny them oxygen, and they go through this process of alcoholic fermentation.